Hi, this is Tony Williams, and welcome to another close read. We'll be looking at a couple very interesting primary sources, and we are very honored to have an illustrious scholar of the antebellum period with us, Dan Monroe. Dan Monroe is an associate professor of history and the Department of History and Political Science chair at Millikin University. He earned his doctorate at the University of Illinois, Champaign. He has also taught teachers for several years at the Ashbrook Center's Master's Program for Teachers. Dr. Monroe is currently president of the Illinois State Historical Society and is a member of the board of the Abraham Lincoln Association. Dr. Monroe serves as the Illinois historian on the board of trustees of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. He has received many awards for teaching and was a fellow at the Virginia Historical Society and Lincoln Legal Papers. He's the author of 3 books, including The Republican Vision of John Tyler. He is currently working on his 4th book on President James Polk and has contributed to BRI's Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Dan, I want to thank you very much for joining us for this important topic related to William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass.
I'm happy to be here with you, Tony. Thanks for that glowing introduction.
Sure. Well, it's all of your accomplishments, so you should be recognized for them. So we'll be looking at these documents, these contending abolitionist visions of William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, and these primary sources can be found on our new resource, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Now, Dan, can you start us off by giving us a little brief historical introduction on abolitionism and who exactly were William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass?
I'd be happy to. I think it's important to note that the abolition movement as a kind of radical social movement really takes off after 1830. Prior to 1830, in response to the ideals embodied in the American Revolution, there were manumission laws that had been passed in southern states, but the process of freeing the slaves was really kind of a genteel thing where individual slave owners who felt a pang of conscience might free their slaves. People like George Washington, for example, freed his slaves at his will at his death. But it was not some big social movement. But in 1830, I think, fired in part by the revivalist evangelical nature of the Second Great Awakening, the movement becomes, or the movement to abolish the slaves becomes a kind of social cause. And William Lloyd Garrison's life really epitomizes that. Garrison's born in Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1808. He grows up in stark poverty. His father was a sailing master who shrewdly moved his family to Newburyport from Canada right before the Embargo Act kicked in, and then was thrown on the beach and couldn't earn a living and actually deserted his family and just disappeared.
Wow.
And so Garrison grew up in stark poverty, and eventually was apprenticed to a printer, and from there his career grew. And during the course of his apprenticeship, he became, I think, in part imbued with the evangelical fervor of the Second Great Awakening and seized on first temperance and then abolition as a cause, a kind of life's work, if you will. We know that he began in this regard in Baltimore, working on an abolition newspaper with Benjamin Lundy, but was jailed for his criticism of slaveholders in Baltimore, and refused to pay a fine to get out of jail, and so spent some time in prison, or imprisoned until he was freed because another abolitionist paid his fine. Then he goes back to Massachusetts and starts the Liberator, his famed abolition newspaper in Boston in 1831. And it's in the Liberator that Garrison expounds his uncompromising version of abolitionism, that emphasized no union with slaveholders, that the Constitution was, as we see in the documents today, was a kind of covenant with death, that slavery could only be ended by a kind of unceasing moral argument, that violence couldn't be tolerated, that it should be, pacifism should rule, and that essentially any kind of political activity was illegitimate, that you couldn't get involved in politics because of necessity. Politics involves the compromise, accepting half a loaf when you want a whole loaf. And Garrison said that's morally impossible when dealing with an evil institution like slavery. I think it's also important to emphasize that Garrison's language was intensely harsh. I mean, as you know, Tony, if you looked at Garrison's words, he condemned slaveholding in the stark language, and anyone who he viewed as complicit in slave owning or in slavery in language that was equally fierce. You know, for example, when Daniel Webster supported the Compromise of 1850, Garrison calls him a lickspittle. You know, and he referred to slaveholders as vampires sucking the blood of the nation. So, and that language could be problematic at times. You know, in other words, on the one hand, Garrison said in stark moral terms why slavery was a bad thing, which was good. I mean, people had to recognize that slavery was not. It was in fact a very evil institution that was antithetical to American principles. On the other hand, it did spark a certain amount of outrage simply because of the harshness of his language. Lots of people at the time have remarked on that, you know, contemporaries and people since. As for Douglass, of course, Douglass is born in a slave in Maryland. Grows up on the Y plantation, which was run by an overseer who also owned Douglass. His name was Anthony, and well, he was probably Douglass's father. Douglass did not know who his father was, but it was probably this overseer, Aaron Anthony. And as a slave, then Douglass experiences all of the worst that slavery had to offer. I mean, he saw other slaves being beaten, sexually abused. He himself was beaten. He worked on plantations. He worked in the city. He was in Baltimore for a time, where he worked on the docks and had to turn over his wages to his owner. So in many respects, Douglass's life as a slave is a kind of microcosm of slavery as it exists in the South. I mean, he experienced, perhaps not everything, but pretty close to everything that a slave could experience. He determines to become free. He has a kind of dramatic example or instance of resistance against a so-called slave breaker that he'd been sent to because of his defiant attitude, a man named Edward Covey, where Douglass actually fights him, and at which point Covey kind of leaves him alone. And Douglass says in his narrative of his life that, this was the moment when I determined that I would be free, that I had kind of stood up for myself and survived. And so he escapes to the North. In 1838, he disguises himself as a sailor and manages with forged papers to get to the North, where he works or settles in New Bedford, Massachusetts. In 1839, he listens to Garrison give a rather dramatic, Garrison was, of course, a wonderful lecturer too as well. He listens to Garrison give this lecture and is fired with his own view that he too, has a great desire to participate in the abolition movement. In 1841, Douglass famously gives an address in Nantucket with Garrison in the audience, and Garrison says, "We got to get this guy, we got to get this guy around the United States, because Douglass would tell, Douglass was a very, as you know, Tony, Douglass was a very imposing presence. He had a baritone voice. He was 6'4", and he was, by all accounts, just a naturally gifted speaker. So Garrison enlists him in the cause, and Douglass becomes a great abolitionist lecturer, and off his career goes. And perhaps I should stop there.
No, that's okay, because the two work together, right?
Yeah, right.
Years. And I think that there's some tension evolves because Douglass wants to be his own man. Garrison seems to be restricting Douglass to just talking about his own experience rather than actually commenting on the evils of slavery. And Douglass sort of broke free of that, became, his own speaker, started his own newspaper, the North Star, and also breaks, as we'll see, in a lot of the political philosophy from Garrison, breaks with his ends and means of how to go about achieving abolitionism.
That's right. I mean, I think Douglas was very influenced by Gerrit Smith, and Gerrit Smith's view was that in fact, the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. It was not a kind of covenant with hell, the way Garrison described it. So, yeah, and I agree with you too as well that I think Douglas wanted to be his own person, and Garrison really was someone who felt that these are the principles of the abolition movement. You must swear fealty to them, and if you do not, a pox upon you. You know, you will be assailed by an insulting editorial and rid down the movement. And you know, I think Douglas, to his credit, I mean, after all, Douglas's life story lends itself to resistance to having others dictate your course. And so in the end, I think he came to his own conclusions. He was tired of telling the same old story of his life in front of another group and wanted to have his own, you know, put his own philosophical imprimatur out there. And so that leads to a kind of inexorable conflict with Garrison.
Right. Well, why don't we go ahead and dive into the, yeah, exactly right. But and so let's dive into the documents here. You know, to give Garrison his due, right? As you said, he really hones in on the Declaration of Independence and the principles contained therein, rather than the Constitution, which he calls a covenant with death. And you can see this right on this slide, right? He talks a lot about the rights of man, talks about human freedom and equality there. Again, down at the bottom, he talks about the rights of man are inherent and unalienable. And so really elevates the principles of the Declaration, and then finishes in that last line, let the American Union perish. Let these allied states be torn with faction or drenched in blood, right? And he doesn't care much about the union, right? He's willing to let it go. No union with slaveholders, as you pointed out. And again, here in this slide, he's talking about justice. He's talking about delivering the oppressed, vindicating the brotherhood of man. And so again, elevates kind of those natural rights principles, and yet talks about the Union and the Constitution being conceived in sin here and brought forth in iniquity. It's a career marked by unparalleled hypocrisy, by high-handed tyranny, and a bold defiance of God. So I think there's a principled stand here, but for the Declaration, not the Constitution, and some pretty uncompromising language. Do you see that as well, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is vintage Garrison. You know, he always embraced the Declaration because, of course, the second paragraph of the Declaration, which is natural with its natural rights doctrine, is perfectly consistent with his views of you know, abolition and why slavery was fundamentally untenable. It was inconsistent with the doctrines or the great natural rights language of the Declarations, therefore should be done away with. But you can also see his intense, uncompromising attitude. You know, and it just has to be said. I think this is an element of the Second Great Awakening in Garrison. That is to say, you can't compromise with evil. If something is evil, it has to be done away with, and any kind of half measures make you complicit with evil. It's something that made it very difficult, I think, culturally and politically for Garrison, for the abolition movement to move beyond its kind of narrow membership, because you know, for example, in the South, obviously there's no room for compromise here. I mean, Garrison denounced gradualism, any kind of colonization, any kind of half measures that might allow slavery to persist for a time was simply unacceptable to Garrison. In a lot of ways, it's the difference between Garrison and Douglas, I think, comes down to the difference between a kind of the radical desire to, you know, be kind of morally perfect to the point of burning down every institution, as opposed to the reformers' desire to work within the system and recognize that the system has strengths that you can use to achieve desired ends.
Right. So his means are his ends are perhaps correct, at least in terms of equal rights for all and the enjoyment of natural rights. But it really strikes me that if you're going to talk about certain civic virtues like prudence and moderation and how that leads to political compromise. Uh, I think it's fair to say Garrison is sorely lacking in a Lincolnian or Douglas-like prudence.
No, that's right, and I'm glad you mentioned Lincoln because Lincoln in his temperance address. I mean, I always use the analogy that Lincoln's approach to the problem of alcoholism in the period, which was a terrible problem, the problem of addiction. And I'm sorry if this seems like I'm drifting away from the topic, but
No?
but it's relevant. His approach to the problem of addiction was let's embrace the addict, let's not condemn them. And in the same fashion, Lincoln approaches slavery. Well, it's an evil. He always said it was morally wrong, but let's not necessarily condemn the evildoer. Let's embrace them and see if we can work out some kind of a path to do away with this evil. Well, as you suggest, Tony, that's prudence. That's an emphasis on social order and working within norms in the system. It's the reformers' agenda. Whereas the Garrisonian agenda is the more radical agenda to say this is a terrible thing and anything complicit with it should be burnt to the ground. As you know, in 1854, he publicly burns a copy of the Constitution, and then when it turns to ash, throws it onto the ground and steps on it. And you see here in this passage that you just pulled up, he finds there's nothing virtuous in the Constitution at all.
Right. And so he really takes the view agreeing with others such as Roger Taney, as Stephen Douglas, and John Calhoun and others that the Constitution was a pro-slavery Constitution. Can you explain that a little bit?
Oh, that's a good point. And it was something that contemporaries remarked upon to kind of tweak Garrison. In other words, when Garrison has this fierce critique of the Constitution that you see in front of you now, where he points out that, the slave trade clause, it makes the country complicit with allowing the slave trade to exist. The 3/5 clause allows extra representation for slave owners. All of this suggests that the Constitution kind of sanctions slavery and is complicit with this evil. And at the time that Garrison is making this point, or within the antebellum time frame, you had Southerners say, well, I don't really like Garrison, but by the way, he makes pretty good argument in our favor for the Constitution. This Constitution really sanctions slavery. I think it's James Henry Hammond or someone, one of these slaveholders who tells Calhoun, we ought to take this Garrison's talk on how the Constitution is a slaveholding document and snip out the abolition parts and use the good parts. So that's that's a big issue that differentiates Garrison from Lincoln, from Douglas, of course, and from others who strongly disagree that the Constitution is in any way complicit or even sanctions slavery. And again, I think it's the difference between the radical and the reformer. I think Garrison is the radical that finds no virtue at all in anything associated or maybe in any way, in his view, complicit with slavery, versus the reformer who sees virtue there.
Right, and so we see on this slide, he's calling it that covenant with death, the agreement with hell. He says the American Union is a stupendous imposture. And the watchword of every uncompromising abolitionist, of every friend of God and liberty, must be, both in a religious and political sense, no union with slaveholders. And I just wonder if he's willing to just let the union go, right? If he's not engaging in politics, just let the Southerners leave with their slaves. What practical power, what moral persuasion, what political pressure could then abolitionists or those who even just who are opposed to slavery, what pressure could they bring to bear? Then it strikes me that the Garrisonian solution in this sort of moral purity and creating sort of a union that just absolutely committed to all of its principles with no compromise. Uh, would that allow slavery to endure in an even greater way in the South? What do you think of that?
Well, I think that here's what I would say. I think the abolition movement and Garrison's rhetoric sparks a kind of counter reaction to in the South that in effect dooms slavery. That is to say, the Southern reaction to the abolition movement is to violate the Bill of Rights. It's to burn abolitionist literature. It's to drive people of anti-slavery sentiments from the pulpit or from professorships in universities. It's to prohibit the talking about abolitionism or anti-slavery, the argument in any way in newspapers. And that reaction actually is more concerning to people in the North than the perceived harshness of Garrison's rhetoric. In other words, people in the North are kind of vaguely anti-slavery in the 1830s and 1840s, but then they look at the Southern reaction to it and think, good heavens, if the Bill of Rights can be violated in South Carolina, or in Charleston where the sheriff inspected the mail and took out abolitionist literature and piled it in the center of the town square and burned it up. Well, if they can do that in Charleston and there's no sanction, and the federal government in the Jackson administration does nothing, what's to keep the sheriff from Springfield, Illinois from doing the same? I'm very concerned about that. I'm less concerned about the slavery from the humanitarian perspective, but if I'm a scratch farmer in Illinois, I'm very concerned about the fact that maybe the Bill of Rights can be violated with impunity and there's no consequence. So I think that, and I don't know that Garrison necessarily intended this, that the Southern reaction would prompt concern in the North, but that's precisely what happened. I mean, I think in the North, if you look at northern antebellum newspapers, you see a lot of concern, and this is also expressed on the floor of Congress by John Quincy Adams and others. What's going on in the South, this counter-reaction to Garrison is very concerning because it violates the Bill of Rights.
Very interesting. Well, we have another very important document that I would love to dive into. It's Frederick Douglass, and it's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And this is given in 1852, about almost 8 years before the start of the Civil War. And it's a very, very interesting document. And something I want to point out already is that as he's talking about this great celebration of the 4th of July, of our independence, of the Declaration of Independence, of all those ideals, and he celebrates them. But as you can see in this very first paragraph, he says, it's your political freedom. It's your nation's destiny. It's your national independence, right? Because African Americans are not included, and we'll see more of that in other slides as he uses this rhetorical device throughout the speech. And he says something very interesting here too. He says, I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny, so indeed I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. So on one hand, he seems to be elevating these principles as true principles, as immutable principles of human nature and of natural rights and of self-government, and yet saying, well, but there's a large group of people who are not enjoying those rights, and so it's really sort of the white man's holiday.
Oh, that's right, and I think that what Douglass, to me, Douglass, you've put your finger right on it, Tony. Douglass embraces and celebrates the Declaration of Independence. I've always thought that this line where he calls the principles in the Declaration saving principles is one of the great lines in Douglass's career. It's Douglass's central message. Really what he's saying here is we need to go back to first principles. Our principles are sound, but the application is unsound. We're not living up to these things. And this is where Douglass breaks with, I think, Garrison in some sense, although Garrison says we're not living up to them as well. But Garrison sees the country not savable. Essentially he's kind of given up, I think. Douglas does not. Douglas has this unshakable faith in American principles and the American nation to live up to those principles. It's not doing so now, he's saying, in 1852, but it's very possible, and he believes, I think, that it will. I mean, Douglas's message is, on first glance, I think people might say, well, this is really gloomy, but actually it's quite hopeful. All he's doing is saying, look, and by the way, I think this is very similar to what Lincoln is saying in the Peoria speech and elsewhere. Douglas says, by the way, our principles are sound, but we have to live up to them. And until we do, I can't celebrate the 4th of July in the manner that you do. And Lincoln says the same thing. I mean, Lincoln in the Peoria speech, look, we're in danger, if we allow slavery to grow, of becoming something that we are not, right? Or that we never intended to be. We're not living up to first principles. We have to restrict it and put it on a course of ultimate extinction.
Right. And he continues in that vein, right? On this side, he says the rich inheritance, he calls it a rich inheritance of justice, of liberty, prosperity, independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. So again, alluding to these principles as true principles, but I'm not sharing them, and I should be. And he goes on, the sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me, whippings and death. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn, right? It's pretty hard hitting, right? He's calling out America, right? He's calling out Americans. He's taking Americans to task to live out their principles. And he goes on to say, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass confronted in impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. So Dan, hard-hitting rhetoric, right? He's not really pulling any punches, and yet, unlike Garrison, he's not attacking the principles, he's not attacking the documents, he's not attacking the Union, merely the inability of the American regime of Americans to live up to those principles.
Oh, that's exactly right. And it has to be said that this was Douglas's abolitionist argument. He would go before audiences and say, here's what I endured as a slave. And this is why these are examples of slavery's, injustices and abuses and its bad things. So here you have on the 4th of July, essentially him making that case again, saying, look, we're tolerating an institution that, because if we're really a natural rights principles, we can't tolerate, we can't allow it, we can't permit it for all the reasons that he's listed here. And it renders the great Republican experiment, in which, I think Douglas would say collectively we're all engaged in, hypocritical.
Mm-hmm. Right, and he continues, and what I think is so interesting in comparing and contrasting these two documents is he says that the Constitution, much unlike Garrison, he calls it a glorious liberty document, right? Well, I mean, what a beautiful way to phrase it. And he says that he basically calls the Constitution an anti-slavery document. So the radical abolitionist Garrison calling it a pro-slavery document, and yet the former slave who's become an abolitionist, is calling it an anti-slavery constitution. Can you explain his thinking about the anti-slavery constitution?
So Douglas is believed, and I think he's drawing on Garrett Smith and Lysander Spooner and others who were making this argument in the 1840s, and Douglas being convinced by it. Douglas felt that the Constitution, properly construed, really does not embrace slavery.
Hmm.
And by the way, Sean Wilentz has written a very fine book on this that makes the same case. It just came out recently. And he noted, just like Douglas noticed, that nowhere in the document is the term slave or slaveholding used. And Walentz's argument, as a modern scholar, is that the Constitution, in fact, does not recognize property in men, and that the founders at the convention were adamant in avoiding that. That is to say, the founders did not intend for the Constitution to embrace slavery. They were forced to make some concessions. Lincoln calls them refers to it as the kind of in a broad way as the doctrine of necessity. Out of necessity, the founders had to deal with slavery because it existed, and it was necessary to make some concessions to it for the sake of unity. But beyond that, they would not go and did not intend to go because they wanted the slavery to put on the course of ultimate extinction. Douglas comes to that same conclusion and believes that very strongly. And so Douglas's argument is, and it's not specifically detailed here in the 4th of July speech, but basically he says, look, if you look at various elements of the Constitution, like the Privileges and Immunities Clause, they are, or the Fifth Amendment, they clearly are antithetical to slavery, or the preamble, which says, this document is designed to secure the blessings of liberty to all. Well, in other words, Douglas takes this and sees the Constitution in a very constructive way, as he says here, as a glorious liberty document. And therefore it was, and the larger point is, or the next logical point would be, it's perfectly defensible to work within the political system to try to reform it, to eliminate slavery by electing congressmen, by electing senators, by electing governors, by getting involved in the political process.
Right. Which is something that Garrison eschewed, right? He said,
Yes.
don't participate in politics, right? But Douglas is working within the constitutional framework of citizenship and consent, and wants to lend his voice to anti-slavery. So we end on this note. As you said, Douglas is very hopeful. He says, I do not despair of this country. And he says, I'm leaving off where I began with hope, right? And he says, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. So I'll give you the last word on Douglas's hopefulness.
I think it's one of the most wonderful things about Douglas and about reading Douglas is that, when you consider Douglas's life story, the privations that he had endured and the abuse, and yet he emerges from this and recognizes that these principles of the United States are sound ones and are antithetical to tyranny, antithetical to slavery, and that the country was inevitably tending in the direction of eliminating slavery, which it does. That is to say, Douglas saw hope even in the darkest hours of the abolition movement, when it seemed as though that slavery was going to be this kind of permanent institution. And he was right. His hope was not misplaced. And the country does embrace the anti-slavery cause, and in fact fights a fratricidal civil war, a terribly bloody civil war, to end the institution. So I think Douglas was right. I think Douglas recognizes that the principles of the Declaration are, as he said, saving principles, and inevitably the tyranny and the oppression of slavery were doomed by them.
Dr. Dan Monroe, thank you for being a friend to BRI. Thank you for enlightening us and sharing us your expertise on these documents and on the historical period in general. And just thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure to be with you, Tony. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks. All of our viewers can view these documents and dozens of others at billofrightsinstitute.org, and just look for the new textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Thank you.